name's Kane Glendenning. I'm a sales engineer. What that means in real terms is I go into different companies around the country, around the region, and show people how Alteryx can integrate into their existing ecosystem, how it can get you out of that repetitive drudgery, and performing more tasks that what you would like to do in your job, what you're really paid to do, rather than the repetitive preparing data to not end up getting to as much analytics as you're after. Like this in a second, and it'll switch over. What I'm going to show in those couple of different methods here in the Alteryx Designer is I'm going to show how we've been doing this for a couple of years, for at least 5 or 10. And I'm going to go through the Alteryx Designer here, which is the platform that hundreds of thousands of users around the world love and use every day in order to get their analytic workflows built in the first place, tested, and then they can productionize it on an Alteryx server. I'm then going to show how we've then enabled more people that don't understand anything about predictive analytics at the start, or understand a very minimal amount, how we've enabled those people now to be able to move into that more advanced analytics world. So I'll start with basics here. This is the Alteryx Designer. We've got the different tool palettes across the top here. A couple hundred tools delivered out of the box in Alteryx. I then have a workflow built here that what it does is it brings in a customer list. In this case, I've got a campaign that we ran in Melbourne. And so I've got the Melbourne customer list and some transactions and whether those people responded to that campaign. I can then train in a predictive model that I can then use to score the Sydney customers to figure out what the response rate is going to be on that campaign if we lift and shift that to another area. So all in all, it's a pretty simple process, but if the first step is download R or download Python, then a lot of people are just cut out of that process. So with Alteryx, we've enabled people to be able to be involved in those procedures, like scoring a marketing list, that a lot of people in this room would understand what that means, but may not be able to code that up in R or Python. The first thing that I do need to know here is that I've got to prepare the data properly. It was shown earlier that nobody, or very few, I couldn't see any hands, has their data in one data source for an analytics process. That doesn't really exist, and the data's not in the right form for that process that you want to do. The data's sitting there and then it's available for many different processes. Of course, every process that you want to perform is not going to be requiring the exact same data structure. So the first thing that I have to do is join the customer list with the transactional records from 2 different systems. I've got to do some preparation here because when I start exploring this data, coming from the transactions here, I can click on the quantity ordered column down here and I can see that I've got some null records here. 1.3% of that column is null. I need to fix that up. That's one of the first things that you learn about predictive analytics is null records are bad. It's probably the entry-level data cleansing part that has to be done. If I want to explore this a little bit more, I can just filter this column. So I might just filter it so that I just get the records that are null. Hit apply. I can see that change down the bottom. I can then explore it a little bit further. So if I click on unit price there, on the left-hand side I can see that 1% of the data that has no quantity ordered column filled out also has no unit price either. So that gives me some information that I'm missing data at first. I could sort by my order date here in order to figure out whether maybe that data is not being counted for a couple of months. And coming up in a version very soon, once I've done all that filtering and sorting, I'll be able to hit apply and those icons will be added to the canvas so that I keep that auditability. As it stands at the moment, you're able to explore down here and then when you click off, of course, it reverts back to how the data was in order to keep that auditability and repeatability about the workflow. You find when you start to use Alteryx Designer that it is those 2 words that I just mentioned that are the big keys. That you can create workflow, and then you just have to hit run next time, and you get the exact same process happening. You don't have to build out a process that could have a mistake in it each time, so you don't have that risk of the data of your results changing next week. You also wind up with an auditable process that other people can understand. Gary mentioned in his performance management workflow there was 18 tools that they used. You might have noticed that they were green, they were blue, they were orange, and they were black there as well. So he had a couple of documentation tools there, a few input tools, some preparation tools allowing people to do those row column based operations that everybody in this room would understand what they are. Creating new fields based off different records, maybe cleansing some nulls out of the data, maybe renaming some fields, those kind of things. There were some purple tools that were included, which are the joining tools, the ability to bring data together, and the orange ones here, which are in the transform palette, and they change the shape of your data. So if I look at the workflow I've got there where I join together these two data sets, I can quickly, with very limited knowledge of actually what's happening here, see that I've connected to a couple of data sources, I've performed some of those row column based operations with the blue icons here, and then at this orange icon, I know that my data is transformed shape. Before the purple here has then joined it together. What I've actually done down here is I've got rid of those nulls out of the data by replacing them with zeros, I've created an extra field, then I've aggregated it before joining onto the customer list. So that way I've prepared my data set for predictive analytics now. I've got it into one table, and I've got here, this responder field, the field that I'm going to try and predict, and I've got a whole lot of predictor variables as well. If I look back here, what I've also done on the customer list is I've just removed some of the fields that I don't want. As I mentioned, I'm going to analyse the Melbourne campaign and then apply that to the Sydney customers. And so things like address, store, name of the customer, I don't need those in the data, so I'm just going to strip those out at first because they're not going to be used in the predictive model. Now, it was mentioned earlier that we cater for that citizen data scientists, all the data scientists, somebody can go in and put in some R code that they've got built already in order to have that as the next step in the flow. But then we have this code freeway with the drag and drop predictive icons here. To enable that capability of training in a model, it's just by dragging an icon onto the canvas and running data into it, configuring it in a nice GUI here, never having to see code. When you look at the analytics process for predictive analytics, then it can be broken down into the preparing the data, acquiring the data, and preparing the data. Then the next step is the training in of the model. Once you've got a model trained in, you've got something configured that you can then use to productionize against different data, and how that's trained in on the data that you already knew the result of. However you train that in, that can then be applied to other data. When you look at it in the Alteryx workflow here, I've got a logistic regression icon here that trains in the data. I then use a model object here that is the output of that icon, and I use that with the scoring tool here, which I'll just zoom in a little bit there, in order to score the data that comes in from my Sydney customer list. So I'm taking that trained-in model and I'm applying that to another data set. And the process that I've just mentioned, I think now after I've mentioned that, then a reasonable amount of people in this room could probably turn around and go and apply that in 5 minutes' time, because you may not have forgotten it by then. But there is still that little bit of a knowledge that is needed at first to apply predictive analytics in that fashion. So move this. At the end here, what I've got as my result is a propensity for each of those customers to respond to that campaign. So a respond to yes column, that I can then do some analytics on that to figure out how many people are actually over 50% chance based on the customers that I've analysed that I did already know whether they've responded to the campaign. That's fine and dandy, that's how people have been doing it for several years. But there's a whole realm of people that don't even want to have to pick which model that they they want to use up top. People that might not be clear on what data types have to be set, on what has to be cleaned up in the data. So that's where we've gone to the next level now. Here I'm going to show the assisted modelling. If somebody is fortunate enough to have already seen it, then well, you're lucky. But this will be released very shortly. It's currently in beta. We've got it's been one of our most responsive beta periods because so many people are interested in it. So we've had hundreds of people around the world just testing it out, seeing how they're going to use it, and it'll be released in. Remember that forward-looking statement screen at the start? It'll be released in some time. So what I'm going to do, I've got my Melbourne customers down the bottom here. First thing I'm going to do is search for the assisted modelling. Type assist up there, and I'm going to drag that icon down onto the canvas. Run my data into it. Because I'll work with this in an HTML interface, I've got to populate that icon with data. So I'm just going to shut down the predict model that's already been done so I can run my workflow here and populate that assisted modelling icon there. Nice and quick. I can now hit start assisted modelling, start to work with the interface. As I've mentioned a couple of times, this is about not just letting people do analytics, it's about teaching people about analytics as well. Modelling for you, but then you have no idea what's happened afterwards, and a decision has to be made in the business, and if you can't explain back to the business actually what's happened through that process, then it's a lot harder to get receptibility. So we're going to go through a couple of steps here. Firstly, we're going to select the target variable and model type that we've got. We're going to go through some data typing steps where we'll figure out whether things are ID fields or whether they're numeric or categorical. Then going to clean up the data set a little bit before then working out which columns we want to keep in our predictive model. We'll get some recommendations as to whether things have enough predictive power to bother with. And of course, at any stage, we can overwrite any of the selections that have been made. Before finally, Alteryx will recommend a couple of different models that you can run, and then you can compare the output of them and figure out which one you want to use. If I hit start building here, you'll notice as I go through that there is a whole lot of information on both the left and right hand sides that will show up at different points. It's giving you information about what's happening so that you can be comfortable in the process here. So first thing we're going to do is select the target variable. In this case, the target variable is responder. That's the one that I want to try and predict. Here I'm just going to select that I want the yes class of interest. When this goes into GA in a short period of time, that class of interest will disappear. We're just going to select that for you. If I hit next here, little warning saying that I can't change that in the future. And then we're going to have a look at some of the data types. On this first one, I'm straight away getting notice that I might want to verify that data type because it doesn't look like it should be numeric. If I look over on the right hand side, there's a 64 or so % chance that the data is numeric, but there's about a 30% chance that the data is an ID field. If I look at this, it's actually the customer ID field, and so I know that's an ID field. I'll change it to ID, and it'll be straight away dropped. I'm not going to use something like the customer ID to try and predict whether somebody's going to respond to a campaign. If that wasn't predicted, then I already know whether a customer's going to respond to a campaign. Later on, I'm also going to get rid of the store number here, just because, as I mentioned, I'm going to apply this to a different region, so the store they shop at isn't as important. I look down here and I've got a lot of numeric fields, and that all makes sense. A customer segment field, if I click on that, and see some data over the right-hand side, just a sample, and that does make sense that it's a categorical field. It's got some data like home office, consumer, small business, so it's definitely going to be a categorical field. I can then hit next and go to the data cleansing part. Straight away I can see that I've got 3 fields that have got null values throughout them. Now if they've got null values throughout them, I have an option either to get rid of those lines or replace them with some other data that I can calculate from the rest of the data set. Over the right hand side we've got a decision tree that explains why these recommendations have been made. So if there's less than 80% of the data is missing and it's not categorical, then the decision tree is saying that we're going to recommend to replace it with the median. I can, of course, click on the glossary here and get a whole lot of more information on what my options are here. If I look at this and have a look at the average transaction value, now I'm only missing 3.8% of it, and given what that field is in a transaction value field, I might want to replace that with the mean instead of the median. Although we make all these recommendations as to what you should do, at any point you can override them. The theory being, you know more about the data than any kind of computer. So if I hit next there, I'm then presented with a list of all the columns, and we'll just run some quick algorithms behind the scenes there to figure out how important each of those variables were. I said before that I'm going to get rid of store number. See, the predictive power is like 6% is the minimum there. So I'm going to leave all those in the data set for the moment, and you see the recommended column. The system modeling capability here is recommended to leave them in the data set. But again, you can just remove any of those if you look at it and it doesn't make sense, maybe, to include that. Then when I hit next, I've got 3 different algorithms that have been proposed. I can see in the middle there the interpretability, the bar there. If I look on the right hand side here, the interpretability refers to how easy it is for a human to interpret the model's output and understand how it predicted the outcome. On a forest model, that's a little bit lower because it's a little bit harder to conceptualize what it looks like. With a decision tree, you can look at a graph and see the decision tree, where the splits are made and how many records are left at the bottom. A forest model being 500 of those decision trees and an algorithm to work out what the most important ones are. Of course, it's a little bit harder to visualize and conceptualize. So in this case, I'm just going to deselect that because it'll be hard for me to explain back to the business later. I've just got some extra volume. And I'm just going to let Alteryx run the logistic regression and the decision tree off against each other. We've made some samples behind the scenes, added in just some cross validations, but you'll be able to edit those later if you like. I can then view that in a leaderboard, and I'll just go straight to the comparison. I can, of course, look at the entire configuration here as to what happened along each of those steps. And on the comparison here, I can have a look at the accuracy and the balanced accuracy. Balanced accuracy will split it into positive and negative responses, and it'll give you more of an option to, more of an ability to compare like for like. In this case, logistic regression is performing better in both cases. So I'm going to select to use the logistic regression here. And I've got an option that I can score data automatically. So I'm going to select that. We can see there's a couple of different icons that are running across the top here. When I exit the canvas, that's all going to be dropped onto my Alteryx canvas. So that way I can go back at any stage, have a look what's happened. If I hit exit the canvas, and you can see that I've actually got each of those steps that I took are now laid out across the screen. If I click on the first one here, it's explaining that if I change the customer ID column to an ID, I can of course change that option that I made there. I might realise that I didn't select something before, so I can always change that now. As I move along, each of those steps are documented here. I've imputed some values to replace some nulls and so on and so forth. Then got my modelling happening, and at the end here, I am going to use the models being created in order to score data. I have to now grab those Sydney customers, plug that in there, and I'll add a browse after at the end. Now when I hit run, pretty easily we've created a process that's going to train in a predictive model and then score those customers for me. At the end here, we have we have a responder predicted column that we can have a look at. As this goes into GA, you'll also have a percentage there. It's the same as you did on the other one, so you can see just what the propensity was for a customer to respond as well. You can also, for those that might be curious, you can always plug this into our Python tool, and if you know Python, you can plug it in and just grab the model out of it as well if you want to. As with the drag and drop icons up the top that are built using the R tool by default, then you can also save that binary object, save that binary object so then you can productionize it somewhere else without having to train the model in every time. So just to highlight, there's a couple of things that I did mention a few times. Essentially, what we're trying to enable is no matter where you are on with your ability to get into the advanced analytics or the predictive analytics world, we're trying to get an access point that you can come in and ramp up, move to that next step as the world moves towards more of an advanced analytics need. Then we have to empower you guys to be able to step in, learn more, do more, not waste as much time on the repetitive drudgery that you don't want to do, and add value to companies, unlock some of that value hidden in the data. Hopefully that came across there with the two different examples, and as I mentioned, Libby mentioned earlier, that you can always just put raw R and Python code in as well, if somebody's more comfortable with that. At that point, I'm going to call Libby and Gary back up onto the stage and we might take some questions.
So I noticed that you have dragged the Sydney data straight into the predictive model.
Yeah.
So is that assuming that the Sydney data is already cleansed and not go through the middle process?
Yep, so what I've done there, and the exact same process that I did, or almost the same process, I've actually just already got that prepared. So it's not the exact same process because I don't have to sort out the nulls and things like that. I'm not going to repeat any of that. It's just joining the two data sets together.
Set versus the validation set automatically?
Yeah, so in the system modeling, that's taken care of straight away. When you're doing it manually, you can use create samples there to split it out into estimation and validation. Something that I haven't done here just because a full sample is fine. But in this system modeling, that's all taken care of behind the scenes in a couple of different cross-validation ways.
Yeah. I came in with late, so I might have passed this. The responder predictor, that's a binary outcome, which is an yes or no.
Yeah.
Can we also come up with a list of predictions? For example, categorization or taxonomy prediction.
Yeah, so looking at a multivariable workflow. So how I've seen that done most successfully is using decision trees. In this system modeling, I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen as we remove that class of interest. Actually, if you've got multiple values in that field, like maybe 6 or 7, then it will be that we'll just recommend certain models. So yeah, that definitely will work still because it works with the standard predictive tools as it is.
All the questions seem to be on this side of the room. We've got to go over here to get some activity going.
If we wanted to, so forth. In this situation, up the top, I better just run that again. Then you've got some reports that come out to the other side of that tool, which I'll show in a second.
Can we see the coefficients?
So that's actually going to be released in GA. It's not in it at the moment for the assisted modeling. It will be in it either the first or second version when it's officially released. The ability to just see the coefficients blankly. At the moment, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it, but it's not as exposed. So that's something that we heard during the beta that people wanted, and we've already built that in the version. It's going to be released.
Thanks for the talks. I've noticed that the focus has been on analytics here. Fair enough, that's the name of the session. But I also think Alteryx Index is an ETL tool, right? And so I'm wondering when you go onto the cloud, when all this stuff goes onto the cloud, because I think that's a pressing need for a tool that's so easy to use like Alteryx, yet operates in the cloud.
Sure. I'm happy to come in. So when you're talking about in the cloud, you're talking about Alteryx functioning, like you're not having to install it or anything, is that what you mean?
Well, no, like distributed computation.
Yep.
Like
Yep. So, I'm not sure. That forward-looking statements is so important.
Yeah, from a futures perspective, we're not going to talk today about future plans, but we definitely understand the importance of taking advantage of other deployment options. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
You're up here, big tools that can run on.
Sorry?
Sorry?
Big tools that server?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the moment you can, just with what's actually already released, you can push data, processes down onto a database server using database palette. You can distribute or point a workflow to a certain worker node that might be next to the data. So one of the examples is you can have a server node that's called Germany and a server node that's called Australia. And depending on what data you're actually processing, you can push the operation to happen on that work node. You could have a giant node there that is just for heavy predictive analytics, and you can tag that, make sure that anything heavy predictive analytics runs on that. You can also, using the Apache Spark code tool here, push Python Scala code straight down onto a Spark cluster as well. So that's all released, but the distributed node computing, watch your space.
For auditability, can you also show how for each specific prediction, which variables had the most effect for it?
You can. In the assisted modeling, it's not as exposed at the moment, but there's a couple of different levels. You can have a look at the output here, which if I open that up, I've got a few different tabs that I can look at for my results. I've also got here, right down to the rock charts and so forth. I've also got reporting that I don't have a browse tool on at the moment, that if I was to put a browse tool on that middle node, I get some of the standard R reports. We then, if you want to go further, then there's a couple of different predictive icons that you can download from our Alteryx Gallery, which is our public Alteryx Gallery, that are free to download, that allow you to interrogate those coefficients and things in a lot further detail.
Cubes, how does that work?
Yeah, so you can directly access HANA databases, so you can push processing down onto HANA databases. A lot of people talk about, when they talk about SAP, they talk about SAP BW. There is ways that connect through that way, but people come across problems because SAP BW is not a data access point, it's a reporting engine. So it falls over when you try and access a whole load of data through it. But as for HANA, which is where SAP is trying to move everybody to, then I mean, there's direct access to the database pretty easily.
I didn't actually have a question, I just want to see JJ run across the room. Actually, question for Gary. Thanks for insight in JLL. How do you get people to use Alteryx? How do you convince them that there's a better tool out there? How do you break them away from Excel and some of the old crap that people use?
Thanks, Peter. Great question, mate. It doesn't take much convincing. The results speak for themselves. So, as I said, we build a community around people that want to do more with data. I don't try and force it on anyone. If they don't want to do it, they do it. I don't care. We've got people that are really, back into all my buddies, they're really keen about doing more with data. So for me, it's actually, maybe I'm right, it's just easy. Alteryx is easy. The people are keen. You put the two together and it just works.
Maybe they're all actually scared of Gary, and so they just do what he says.
They're not here today.
I'll add on to that, PK, on that question, because we do hear that a lot. I think it also speaks to the culture of companies in the environment of it's okay to try new things. It's okay to fail, even if you're trying new things, because you're just going to try again. And so I think that's also part of it, is from a leadership perspective, it's that ability to say, let's try this, it's okay, let's try a new way. So that goes to that ability to transition what you're describing of out of the old way, out of the way we've always done it, to let's try something new. So it's inbred. From a leadership perspective, we have to say it's okay to try something new.
I've got a question for Gary. In terms of barriers to use of Alteryx, did you find don't want to be too blunt here, did you find the cost at all a barrier? And I say this coming from an organisation who doles out Tableau developer licenses like that, gold.
The answer's no.
But I'll give customer sockets on that way. No, look, really, you've got to have a business case for everything, right? We're commercial organisations for the most part, and things need to stack up. So I get that, and I understand why we're so careful with making sure that we're making the right decision. The use cases in most organisations pay for themselves pretty quickly. And as I said, I do expect people to be able to find a use case to pay for a license fairly quickly. It might not be in a week, maybe they're a business analyst, they're not technically sound, it takes a little while to understand data and flow. But generally, most people can find a business case pretty quickly in that trial period. And prove it out. And we're there to help. We've got a community internally, we're building, and we've built some good capability. The community that you can hit up online can always help with that as well. So if you've got a use case you think you want to try through, but you're not quite sure how to deliver it, just hit up the community and people jump in and help out.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now standing between you and drinks, which will be at the bar. Please.